Trigger warning. Before listening in to this episode of Bygone Echoes, we want to provide a quick content warning for our listeners. This episode discusses ghost stories and folklore that often involve themes of violence, death, suicide, child loss, betrayal, and grief, as well as systematic pressures like patriarchy, colonialization, and gender-based oppression. While these tales are rooted deeply in history and cultural critique, they can be emotionally heavy for some listeners. If these topics feel like they may be too much for you today, that is totally okay. Take care of yourself. And feel free to skip this episode or revisit it when you're ready. Your well-being is top priority.
Bygone Echoes.
Hey there, history and mystery lovers. Welcome to Bygone Echoes, a history podcast where we dig up the past, shake off the cobwebs, and maybe unearth a ghost or two. I'm your host, Courtney. And today, we are chatting about one of the most haunting and persistent figures in spooky folklore, the Lady in White. You know who I mean. That mysterious feminine figure in flowing white who always seems to show up in every culture's tragic ghost story. Now, I have always had a soft spot for ghost stories. Yes, they're creepy, but they're also oddly comforting. Think about it. These stories are like little time capsules of human emotion that we've been passing around the proverbial campfire for generations. And yes, they are meant to give us the goosebumps, but the best ones, they're about love and loss and all of those messy human feelings that we're still trying to figure out. These stories are not just spooky, they're human. And okay, seriously, I'm not saying I'm ready to host a seance in my living room. I do not own a Ouija board, but I do have some super cute tarot cards. But there's a part of me that likes to leave the door open for possibility. The possibility of ghosts and the supernatural. Like, do I believe that there's a spectral woman hitchhiking on Chicago's Archer Avenue? Not really. Do I find it oddly reassuring that so many people believe that they've seen her for decades now? Absolutely. It's proof that we're still curious. We're still looking for meaning and still trying to make sense of the world. And that's kind of beautiful, don't you think? For me, the Lady in White is the MVP of spooky folklore because she always just shows up in one form or another across time. Anywhere that people call home, you can find a story of a lady in white. But why is this figure always a woman? Why is she always associated with the color white? And why is her story almost always linked to tragedy? And that's part of what makes her so haunting. She's not just a ghostly figure in a flowy white dress. She's a glimpse into the fears we've carried, the pain we've romanticized, and the stories we've told about ourselves and about women and tragedy and justice. She's a shadowy thread that ties together centuries of folklore, stretching from lonely highways to castle battlements, from misty forests to moonlit cemeteries. Whether you believe in ghosts or just love a good ghost story, I promise there's something here for you. Because even if the Lady in White isn't real, the meaning behind her definitely is. This episode will be a little different from our usual format. Instead of one long story, we are going to go on a ghost story road trip around the world. We'll be walking the halls of mist-shrouded English castles, where every creaking floorboard has a story. We'll venture into ancient Japanese temples, where ghost stories aren't just tales, they're a form of art that'll make your spine tingle in the way that our Western versions never quite seem to manage. Then we'll explore Germany, where folklore runs as thick as the Black Forest itself, before finally circling back to America's haunted highways and battlefields, where our ladies in white still catch the occasional midnight ride. Then we'll take a step back, analyze what these stories mean, and explore how they reflect our shared fears, values, and history. So grab a cozy blanket, turn on the light, or don't if you're feeling brave, and let's explore the haunting tales of the ladies in white.
The mist coiled around me, clinging like cold hands as I wandered the grounds of Portchester Castle. Its ancient walls loomed, heavy with centuries of whispers, their stones steeped in grief. The moat below glistened faintly, a shard of moonlight trapped in its unnatural stillness. Then I saw her. She moved along the battlements, a spectral figure in white that shimmered and faded with the mist. Her dress clung to her as if drenched, water pooling at her feet with every step. Her face, it wasn't anger or fear, but a sorrow so deep it seized my breath. I couldn't move. She paused at the wall's edge, tilting her head as though listening for something lost. My pulse quickened as she stepped forward, her figure dissolving into the air like smoke, vanishing into the moat below. I ran to the edge, my heart pounding in my ears. No splash, no ripples, just the moat's glassy surface, unbroken, reflecting the pale, pitiless moon. The silence pressed in, but it wasn't empty. It watched me, ancient and knowing. Charlotte White, the White Lady of Portchester. The story clawed at my memory, how she had thrown herself into the moat, sacrificing everything to save her child. Her love became her curse, trapping her here, bound to relive the moment of her death. A whisper brushed my ear, soft as a dying breath.
How could you let me go?
My blood froze. I spun around, the mist swirling in my wake. There was nothing, only the mist and the weight of her sorrow lingering in the air.
Portchester Castle is perched on the northern shore of Portsmouth Harbour in Hampshire, England. It's a place where history feels alive in every weathered stone. Thanks to its waterside location, it was a prime spot to keep an eye out for anyone who may be tempted to invade. The Romans built a fort at the site in the 3rd century, and the impressive wall still stands today. After the Romans came the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans in 1066, they reimagined the site as a medieval castle, and over time it became a royal residence and then a hub for local governance. By the Victorian era, when Charlotte White's story unfolds, Portchester Castle left its day of royalty and defense behind. Instead, it became a peaceful landmark, its imposing walls standing as reminders of England's long and complicated history. But for all its historical appeal, the castle had a darker, more mysterious side. Its deep moat and quiet, shadowy corners seemed to carry whispers of something unsettled. It was the perfect backdrop for a story like Charlotte White's, one of tragedy and lingering sorrow. According to legend, Charlotte was a mother living near the castle during the Victorian era. One day, while walking with her baby near the castle's moat, disaster struck. Her child fell into the cold, dark water. Without hesitation, Charlotte dove in after the baby, but the moat was deep and the waters were treacherous, and despite her attempts, neither mother nor child survived. But her story doesn't end there. Locals say Charlotte's ghost still haunts the castle grounds. Visitors have described seeing a pale, white-clad figure gliding along the battlements, silent and sorrowful, before leaping into the moat. This ghostly leap, they say, echoes the final heart-wrenching act of her life. Those who encounter her speak of an overwhelming sadness that lingers long after she vanishes. Charlotte White's story stays with you because it hits on something universal: loss, tragedy, and the all-consuming love of a mother. The image of a woman risking everything to save her child doesn't just tug at our heartstrings, it yanks them. It's the kind of tale that transcends time and culture because it's so achingly human. The Victorian era, when Charlotte's legend took shape, had a lot to say about motherhood. Women were expected to be caregivers and moral anchors, their whole identities wrapped up in their family's well-being. Charlotte's desperate leap to save her baby fits perfectly into those ideals of self-sacrificing motherhood. But her story also points to something darker, the fragility of life, in a time when danger and loss loomed around every corner. And then there is the setting, Portchester Castle. With its weathered walls and ghostly moat, it feels tailored to a story like Charlotte's. Castles symbolize strength and endurance, but Charlotte's tragedy flips that script. Her presence reminds us that even the strongest fortress can't shield us from the raw pain of human loss. The part that really gets me, though, the leap. Witnesses say her ghost endlessly relives that heartbreaking moment, diving into the moat in a desperate act of love. It's not just a spooky apparition, it's a symbol of grief so deep that it refuses to fade. And of course, she is wearing white, because in stories like this, white always carried the double meaning of purity and mourning. Portchester Castle might be known for its medieval roots and ghostly legends, but the walls have witnessed more than just myths. They hold stories that stretch beyond knights and royalty, rooted in the complexities of global history. And I would like to share one such story with you because I found it so interesting. In 1796, Britain and France were fighting, per usual, and the fighting had extended to the French colonies. This is also while the Haitian Revolution is on and poppin'. So during this chaos, the British captured over 2,500 prisoners of war from islands like St. Lucia. Among them were 300 white prisoners, but the majority of the prisoners were black or mixed race soldiers and their wives and children. Many of these men had fought for France during this conflict with Britain in exchange for the promise of freedom after slavery was abolished there in 1794. After their capture, the prisoners were transported to England and confined at Portchester Castle. And here's where things get tougher. Imagine being dressed for the Caribbean and suddenly you are in your first English winter. It's like when you travel but you forget to pack a jacket, except this is like survival level unpreparedness. The challenges didn't stop there though. White French officers often got parole, which meant that they could live freely with some restrictions. Black and mixed race officers and their families, though, they endured much harsher conditions. I know I am oversimplifying this to the extreme, but I really found this tidbit of history interesting. Some prisoners were eventually exchanged and sent to France. Others joined French's Black Pioneer Battalion, and some actually returned to the Caribbean, only to face Napoleon's reinstatement of slavery just a few years later. What stands out to me is that it wasn't just a European story. These people were fighting for freedom in the Caribbean, trying to protect the liberty that they had just gained, and then they ended up in this English castle thousands of miles away, swept up in the chaos of revolution and colonialism, and history is just so messy and complicated, and it's so deeply human. And it kind of reminds me that while ghost stories are amazing, I absolutely love them, places like Portchester are also shaped by real lives and real struggles, and those stories also deserve to be remembered.
The night clung to me as I reached the well just beyond the south wall of Himeji Castle. They called it Okiku's well, where centuries of whispers said that her voice still rose in the night. The air was still, as though even the wind was afraid. The stones around the well were worn smooth, their cracks filled with moss older than the stories. I leaned over the rim, the blackness below swallowing the weak glow of my lantern. The depth seemed endless, a void that drank in the light. I told myself it was just a legend, but the tension in the air said otherwise. And then it began. The voice rose softly, coming from everywhere and nowhere. It was steady and calm, yet coiled around me, suffocating in its sadness. My chest grew tight, my breath shallow as the counting continued, each number heavier than the last. The pause after 9 became unbearable. The stories rushed back to me. Travelers who came too close to the well and heard her counting. Farmers who swore the silence after 9 lingered in their dreams. Visitors who spoke of her voice following them long after they'd left the castle grounds. They all said the same. Someone had to say it. I whispered, my voice trembling. The night shifted, growing deeper, heavier. The weight pressed on me, lifted. But the air felt alive, charged, like the world itself was watching. I staggered back. The ground felt unsteady beneath my feet. The well was silent now. But it wasn't peace. It was waiting. I turned and ran. The shadows seemed stretching towards me. I didn't look back. They said her story ended at the well, but the silence that followed me felt like it would never let go.
Himeji Castle, or as it is poetically known, the White Heron Castle, is one of Japan's most iconic landmarks. With its gleaming white walls and graceful design, it looks more like a vision from a dream than a fortress. But behind its beauty lies a darker tale, the haunting story of Okiku and the infamous well that bears her name. Okiku's story has many versions, even inspiring a kabuki play, and none of them end well for her. No pun intended. One of the most popular tellings is of a samurai who became obsessed with her. Okiku was his maid in the household, and she was loyal and virtuous, and she wanted nothing to do with this man. Enraged by her refusal, the samurai accused her of losing one of 10 priceless plates, a crime that could be punishable by death. He offered her an impossible choice: submit to him, become his mistress, and he'll forgive the missing plate. But Okiku stood firm, refusing to sacrifice her dignity, and for that, he tortured her and killed her and threw her body into the well. In the kabuki play, she actually throws herself into the well in despair and drowns. Another version of the tale ties her fate directly to Himeji Castle. In this telling, Okiku served a retainer named Aoyama Tessen, who was plotting treachery against his lord. She overheard his scheme and warned her lover, who was a loyal samurai, and this absolutely ruined Aoyama's plans. In revenge, Aoyama accused her of stealing one of 10 treasured dishes and subjected her to relentless torment before killing her and discarding her body in the castle's well. Yet, her tale is deeply and uniquely Japanese, grounded in the spiritual beliefs of Yūrei, ghosts whose grudges tether them to this mortal world. Unlike Western tales, where white often symbolizes purity or mourning, Okiku's white kimono is a shroud of death, reflecting Japan's funeral traditions. This detail roots her in the customs of feudal Japan, where societal norms often left women like Okiku vulnerable to systematic betrayal. Okiku's story can be described as a mirror held up to feudal Japan, reflecting rigid hierarchies, unchecked power, and the cost of defiance. Whether she's a loyal maid rejecting a samurai's advances, or a brave woman exposing treachery, Okiku's tale is about integrity, resistance, and what happens when someone challenges a system designed to crush them. In feudal Japan, honor was not just important, it was everything. For women like Okiku, especially maids, their life hung by a thread, and it was controlled by the whims of powerful men. Her refusal to submit wasn't just personal, it was a revolutionary act in a society that demanded her silence. Her punishment? Brutal, disproportionate, and more about obliterating her defiance than any concept of justice. Himeji Castle, with its gleaming white walls and serene grounds, seemed like the opposite of Okiku's violent end. But the well where her body was discarded tells a darker story. Okiku's ghost, eternally counting these plates, it isn't just spooky, it's symbolic. That missing 10th plate, it represents betrayal, suffering, and the gaping wounds of injustice. Her restless spirit is a reminder of the wrongs that can't be erased. What makes her tale so haunting is that it isn't just her wails, it's her persistence. In life, she refused to be silenced, and in death, she is impossible to ignore. Himeji Castle may be a masterpiece of architecture, but Okiku's story ensures that it is also a testament to those who stood against oppression and paid the price. Her tragedy isn't just hers. It's a reminder of the systems that allowed it and the courage it takes to fight them.
My footsteps were soundless as I wandered the halls of Hohenzollern Castle, swallowed by the heavy silence that clung to the stones. I wasn't sure what had drawn me here at this hour, but something in the air, a pull, an ache, would not let me stay away. Then she came. Her figure emerged as if from mist, draped in white that shimmered as though woven from starlight. Her face was a mask of quiet devastation, and her presence rippled through the air like a wave. I felt her sorrow before I understood it, a dense, aching weight that pressed against my chest, made my breath come shallow and my legs tremble. She glided forward, her movements fluid yet trembling, like she was both here and not, caught between worlds. I wanted to turn away, but her grief, her overwhelming, suffocating grief, rooted me in place. It wasn't just hers. It was mine and the castle's and the land's. It was ancestral, elemental, a part of the very foundation beneath me. Her gaze flicked toward me, but it wasn't a meeting of eyes. It was a collision. In that instant, I saw it all. Her love twisted into betrayal, her sacrifice distorted into chains, her humanity undone by forces far beyond her control. She wasn't simply a ghost, she was an echo, a scar left by time itself. And now I was caught in her resonance. She turned, moving toward the far end of the hall. Her hand lifted as if reaching for something, or someone, but it wavered, her gesture incomplete. Her form flickered, and then she was gone, dissolving into the mist as though she had never been there. The castle exhaled, and I realized I'd been holding my breath, but the weight in the air remained. Her story wasn't finished. I could feel it in my bones. And somewhere in the distance, the first notes of the castle bells began to toll.
Hohenzollern Castle, perched majestically atop Mount Hohenzollern in the Swabian Alps, stands as a symbol of enduring legacy and architectural grandeur. It serves as the ancestral seat of the Hohenzollern family, a dynasty that rose to prominence as rulers of Prussia and later the German Empire. The castle we see today, a neo-Gothic marvel completed in the mid-19th century under King Frederick William IV of Prussia, is the third iteration on the site, following earlier structures dating back to the 11th century. Yet, beyond its imposing walls lies a haunting legacy that has shadowed the Hohenzollern family for centuries, the tale of the White Lady, or Weiße Frau if you took a couple of years of German in high school like I did. The White Lady is often identified as Kunigunde von Orlamund, a 14th century widowed noblewoman. According to legend, Kunigunde fell deeply in love with Albrecht von Hohenzollern. When Albrecht cryptically remarked that 4 eyes stood between them, referring to his disapproving parents, because Kunigunde was previously married and already had 2 young children, Kunigunde tragically misinterpreted his words. Believing he meant her children, she murdered them in a desperate attempt to be with Albrecht. Her horrific act condemned her to eternal unrest, and Albrecht went on to marry somebody else. So her spirit, draped in white, is said to wander Hohenzollern Castle and other family estates. But this lady in white is more than just a ghost. She is a harbinger of death for the Hohenzollern family. Historical accounts recount her frequent appearances in Berlin's Old Palace during the years 1652 and 1653, each sighting believed to signal an impending family tragedy. Over the years, she has become an enduring symbol of the family's mystique, her presence adding a spectral layer to their dramatic history. While the legend of the Lady in White captivates with eerie details, historical records cast doubt on the specifics. The real Kunigunde von Orlamund was a notable figure, but it is not believed that she had any children, so that's really central to the tragedy, so it makes it more of a folklore than a fact. Still, the story has endured for centuries, weaving itself into the cultural fabric of the Hohenzollern family and their ancestral lands. The Lady in White's tale is a medieval soap opera, stuffed with betrayal, tragedy, and enough supernatural flair to keep her legend alive for centuries. Rooted in the history of the powerful Hohenzollern dynasty, her story wrestles with ambition, guilt, and the devastating consequences of love gone very, very, very wrong. Legend has it that Kunigunde von Orlamund, a noble woman, she fell in love, their communication was not great, and so when he told her about the four eyes standing in the way, she thought it meant the kids, and she cleared the path for them to be together, and then that doomed her in her life and her afterlife. We already mentioned, historically, she actually didn't have any children, which makes the addition of that detail deliberate. By turning her into a failed mother, the story amplifies the emotional stakes, transforming her into a cautionary tale, a figure for ambition, and a reflection of the societal anxieties about women stepping outside of their roles. Her ghost is draped in white. It haunts the castle and the other family estates, and then it appears as a harbinger of death. But her haunting is not just about fear. It embodies the weight of the guilt and the dark consequences of love twisted by patriarchal pressures. The imagined crime of infanticide ties to her tragedy to the universal fear of maternal failures, and that helps make her story stay hauntingly relevant. Hohenzollern Castle, with its neo-Gothic splendor, stands as a monument to power and resilience. Yet the White Lady's tale reminds us no legacy is free from shadows. She's not just a spooky harbinger of death, she is a walking, floating, reminder of how unchecked ambition can turn love into destruction. And here's the kicker. The power of her story does not lie in whether or not it's true. It's how it makes us feel. Kunigunde's tale taps into this universal fear, guilt that won't let go, the ripple effect of our choices, and how the past has a way of showing up uninvited. Whether she is a literal ghost or symbolic with warnings, the Lady in White remains forever woven into the mystique of the Hohenzollern castle. And let's be honest, who doesn't love a good ghost with layers?
The river held its own kind of magic, pulling us closer even as the sun began to sink and shadows stretched long and thin. We were just kids, cousins laughing too loud, daring each other to throw stones farther, to stay longer. Abuela's words echoed in my mind. Don't play by the river when the sun is low. That's when La Llorona roams. But the air felt alive, thick with something we didn't yet understand. So, we stayed. The first cry came soft, almost a sigh carried on the wind. It brushed against my skin, cold and heavy, and the laughter caught in my throat. We froze, our joy swallowed by the sound. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something that didn't belong. I turned toward it, and there she was. She stood on the far bank, her figure draped in white that shimmered faintly, bending the light around her. Her face was hidden beneath dark tangled hair, but her presence spoke louder than words. It wasn't just her sorrow that I felt, it was her love, twisted and sharp, reaching out for something lost. She moved then, not walking, but gliding, the air bending around her as though she didn't belong to this world anymore. Her cries grew louder, a lament that had pressed against my chest and filled my lungs with something I couldn't name. Her grief became mine, raw, unrelenting. Someone whispered. The spell broke. We tore through the trees, her cries staring at our backs, louder, closer, until it felt like the whole forest was wailing with her. I could swear I heard her wail. Just like in the story, when we reached home, Shaking and breathless, Abuela was already waiting. She didn't ask where we'd been. She just crossed herself, her hand steady, her eyes distant, as if she too could hear the wails clinging to us. That night, the river was restless, its voice tangled with hers. I couldn't sleep. Her cries clung to me, filling the air with a grief that had no end, no beginning. We never went back to the river at dusk. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was a story, a truth that lived and breathed, as real as the sorrow that clung to her wail.
La Llorona, a ghost story so famous it echoes across Mexico, the American Southwest, and Latin America, has haunted riversides and imaginations for centuries. Her roots run deep, blending Aztec mythology with colonial Spanish influences. Some even connect her to La Malienche, the controversial figure who aided Hernan Cortez during the Spanish conquest. Like La Llorona, La Malienche is often painted as both a victim and a villain, woman caught between cultures and expectations. The most well-known version of La Llorona's tale begins with Maria, a stunningly beautiful woman who seemed to have it all, a handsome, wealthy husband, children, and social status. But when her husband betrayed and abandoned her, Maria's grief turned into fury. In an unthinkable act, she drowned her children in a river. Consumed by guilt, she then took her own life, but instead of finding peace, she became a restless spirit, doomed to wander in search of her children. If you ever hear her mournful cry, you might want to run. And I clearly do not speak Spanish, and I don't really want to butcher any more languages today. So the phrase that La Llorona is known to say can be translated to, "Oh, my children, where are my children?" La Llorona's legend has endured for generations because it isn't just a scary story. It's a living, breathing part of culture. It's still told today. I read a ton of stories online, actually, of people just playfully using it to spook younger siblings or little cousins. Her legend is still alive in the stories that people tell, in warnings whispered over campfires, and in the way that her wails can make your hair stand on end. The legend is famous, and the influences can stretch all the way from Guatemala to the American Southwest, with some really fascinating regional twists. In some versions, she's a vengeful specter, hunting unfaithful men. In others, she's a guardian spirit protecting children. And in others, she is actually a spirit that kidnaps children. These variations often reflect the distinct cultural or geographical influences of the region where her story has taken root, adding unique layers of meaning. Modern pop culture has also embraced her, though not always with the same depth that her story deserves. Films like The Curse of La Llorona have brought some eerie wails to the big screen, but those glossy Hollywood versions often miss the richness of her cultural and historical origins. Her power doesn't lie in the chills that she gives us, it's in the way that her story connects the past to the present, carrying the weight of centuries of grief, love, and loss. La Llorona is a cultural icon loaded with meaning. Her story reflects the painful collision of indigenous and colonial histories, especially when you connect her to another complex figure, La Malienche. And La Malienche, the way history has treated her, it is a hot mess to say the least. La Malienche's story is much deeper than any of the history classes I took in school led me to believe. She was born, I'm gonna try my best, Malinali, a Nahua girl of noble lineage. She was basically a princess by today's standards. Her education was impressive. She was groomed in diplomacy, language, and culture. But it wasn't to empower her. It was to make her a useful pawn for alliances between powerful men. That was the deal back then for noble girls. Your value wasn't in who you were, but what you could do for your family and, most importantly, the men in your life. But then life for Malinali took a sharp left turn. At some point, she was sold into slavery, according to some sources, and this part sounds straight out of a telenovela. Her stepmother orchestrated her enslavement to make sure that her own son would inherit Malinali's claim to power. Like, we're talking kidnapping an 8-year-old girl, holding a fake funeral using another child's body, and then trafficking Malinali to a different region. Whether or not that part is true, we're not sure, but we do know that young Malinali went from a life of privilege and promise to one of enslavement. It had to be a bleak existence for a very long period of time, and it sounds like she was traded among many different men. By the time she was 19 years old, her enslavers offered her and 20 other enslaved women to the invading Hernan Cortez as a peace offering. She used the tools that she had, her intelligence, her education, her knowledge of various languages and cultures, and yes, even her body, to carve out some measure of power in a system that gave her none. And let me just say this, her relationship, quote unquote, with Cortez was not what anyone would call consensual. Seeing her referred to as his mistress while researching this really irked me to my soul. As his slave, she was not in a position to refuse him or assert her control over her own body. The sexual aspect of the relationship cannot be understood as one of equals. It was shaped by power dynamics, colonialization, patriarchy, and her status as an enslaved woman. She was a survivor. She used what she had to survive in a brutal colonial system that left her with no other good options. And so here's also what struck me as I worked through this story. Both La Malienche and La Llorona are remembered as betrayers. La Malienche is branded as the ultimate traitor to her people, while La Llorona is condemned as a mother who killed her own children. Both are defined by loss. La Malienche's role in the cultural erasure brought on by colonialization, and La Llorona's drowning of her children in an act of despair and rage. And both women are forever haunted, their grief reflecting not just personal pain, but the collective agony of a people whose world was ripped apart. La Llorona's story also critiques the impossible standards forced upon women. Maria is celebrated as the perfect wife and mother, until her husband's betrayal breaks her and she commits the unspeakable act of drowning her children. And her punishment? An eternity of grief, wandering the earth in search of her lost children. The message is chilling. If you step outside the rules society set for you, you will pay for it forever. La Malienche's legacy carries the same weight. Even though she was trapped by a patriarchal colonial system, her choices, her survival, is all been twisted into this cautionary tale about betrayal. But here's what we often miss. These women are not just villains, they're not just victims. They are mirrors. They reflect the legacies of colonialization, the crushing weight of societal expectations, and the deep, enduring grief of being caught in the forces far beyond your control. La Llorona's wails aren't just for her children, they're for an entire way of life destroyed by colonialization. Her story is a reminder of how indigenous people were stripped of their land, their culture, their identities, and the grief that still lingers. And while we are on the subject of indigenous cultures, let's address something else that we've been oversimplifying for far too long. I am embarrassed to admit that I have spent almost my entire life until about a year ago thinking the Aztecs were just one unified empire, a massive one-size-fits-all civilization with the same customs, beliefs, staples, fashion, language, the works. And spoiler alert, that is not true. The term Aztec is a convenient umbrella historians slapped on a much more complex and diverse reality. The people we usually mean when we say Aztec are actually the Mexica. They were just one of many Nahau-speaking groups in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. The region was vibrant. It was a patchwork of different cultures and political systems, and they were all vying for influence and power. The Mexica were incredibly influential, yes, but they were not the whole story. They were not the Aztec. And here's another interesting point. The Mexica and their descendants are also not some long-lost civilization. Surprise! They're still here. Their language, their traditions, they're all alive, thriving, despite centuries of colonization. So when we talk about the Mexica, instead of lumping them under the generic term of Aztec, it gives us a chance to honor their true identity. Stories like La Llorona's don't just live in the past, they echo in the present. Whether she's a tragic mother, a vengeful ghost, a protector of children, the legend continues to hold power. La Llorona reminds us that grief and survival that come with colonialization, of the burdens placed on women, and of the resilience in the stories that we pass down. Her cries are a warning, a lesson, and a legacy that are still alive and well in the tales that we tell today.
My headlights caught her, a pale figure standing by the shoulder, looking straight ahead. I shouldn't have stopped. I knew better than to stop strangers. But seeing her there, all alone on this dark stretch of road, just didn't sit right with me. A woman walking alone at night? Anything could happen. And if it were me, I'd hope someone would stop. And so I pulled over. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice tight as I cracked the window. She turned slowly, and her eyes met mine. They were silver, glowing faint like something alive. It had to be my imagination, right?
"I need to get home,"
she said, her voice soft but steady. Every nerve screamed to drive off, but leaving her felt too cruel. Reluctantly, my hand moved to unlock the door. She slid in, quiet as a shadow, her hands resting on her lap. "Where's home?"
"South,"
she whispered. We drove in silence, her hands never moved, and with each mile, the air felt heavier, colder. When I glanced at her in the mirror, her lips moved, but no sound came out.
"Here,"
she said suddenly, snapping me out of my thoughts. She pointed to a dirt road that ended at an iron gate. Beyond it, a graveyard stretched under the moonlight. "This?" My throat felt tight. She nodded and then stepped out, walking towards the gates as the fog seemed to swallow her. She turned once, smiled an eerie smile, and then disappeared.
Resurrection Mary has haunted Chicago for nearly a century, but for me, she has been haunting my mind since childhood. I have a horrible memory, like I admit that up front, but somehow I vividly remember watching her episode on Unsolved Mysteries. It was summer break, I must have been 8 years old, and I was sitting there with a bowl of self-prepared ramen noodles, eyes glued to the screen, absolutely mesmerized. The combination of spooky narration, ghost reenactments, and that eerie theme music sent chills down my spine as I soaked in every detail. Mary wasn't just a ghost, she became my first real brush with the creepy and the mysterious, and I've been hooked ever since. Our legend starts in the 1930s with Mary. One night, after an argument at the O. Henry Ballroom, later renamed Willowbrook Ballroom, she storms off and decides that she's going to walk home alone along Archer Avenue. But Mary never made it home. She was struck and killed by a car, and her grieving parents buried her in Resurrection Cemetery, dressing her in her favorite white gown and dancing shoes. What fascinates me then, and still does, is what came next. Drivers along Archer Road began to report seeing a beautiful young woman in a white dress. Some said that she was hitchhiking and gave directions to Resurrection Cemetery, only to vanish as they passed its gates. Others saw her walking alone, eerily quiet, before she disappeared into the night. And then there is a famous incident in 1976 when someone claimed to see a ghostly figure gripping the cemetery gates. The iron bars were found to be scorched and bent, as if someone, or something, had left its mark. And then there is the mystery of her identity. Some believe Resurrection Mary was Anna Maria Norkus, a 12-year-old girl who died in a car crash on her way home from the O. Henry Ballroom in 1927. Some believe the ghost is Mary Bregovy, who was also killed in a car crash in 1934. Both were laid to rest in Resurrection Cemetery, adding another layer of intrigue. And as a kid, this story really sparked my imagination. Who was Mary? Or is Mary several different ghosts? Why was she wandering Archer Avenue still? Could you really encounter her if you drove there at night? And naturally, my overly dramatic child brain went, if I was hit by a car, would I have a story like that someday? Would I be tricking guys into giving me car rides only to ditch them before, statistically speaking, anything terrible happened? Even now, I find myself just as intrigued by her story, part ghost tale, part urban legend, and 100% unforgettable. For me, Resurrection Mary isn't just Chicago's ghost. Her story is one of those tales that really made me fall in love with ghosts and ghost stories. Resurrection Mary is a cultural phenomenon that blends history, mystery, and the human fascination of the unknown. As a vanishing hitchhiker, her tale taps into universal fears, encountering something ordinary that turns out to be anything but. The specific locations tied to her story, like Archer Avenue and Resurrection Cemetery, make her legend feel chillingly real. A big part of her allure is the mystery of her identity. Is she Anna Marie Norkus, the 12-year-old girl killed in a car accident after a night of dancing in 1927? Is it Mary Bregovy, the 21-year-old who died tragically in 1934? Or is she a combination of both, shaped by Chicago's collective memory and fascinations with untimely death? This ambiguity doesn't weaken the story, it kind of strengthens it and invites endless speculation, which helps keep her legend alive. Mary's tale also reflects some old-school societal fears about young women and independence. Anna's father was actually criticized for letting her go dance, while Mary Bregovy's death turned into a cautionary tale. Both stories remind us of how fragile life is and how people are quick to judge women for living their lives. For me, Resurrection Mary was a gateway ghost. She's mysterious, spooky, and a little too plausible. The fact that we don't know everything about her is the whole point. It's what keeps us wondering, and a little freaked out even decades later. Let's pause a moment to give shoutouts to some honorable mentions in the world of Lady in White lore, because these spectral queens legitimately deserve their moment. First up, in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, we've got the Lady in White of Glatfelter Hall. She's been spotted drifting through the college historic buildings. Her story is often tied to tragedy and loss related to the Civil War. Now let's head over to East Siberia, where the maidens of Yūrei haunt the Yūrei River. Legend says that these young women were drowned by their own community to protect the village from invaders. Today, their spirits are said to rise from the water, lamenting the lives stolen from them. Is it haunting, tragic, or just plain terrifying? Let's go with all three. Over in South Korea, the Cheonggyeok Shin, aka the Virgin Ghost, takes haunting to a whole new level. Draped in a white hanbok with her long hair obscuring her face, she is the stuff of nightmares and K-drama-worthy chills. Side note, I love K-dramas. These spirits are said to be young women who died unmarried, their restless souls wandering in search of closure, or maybe just someone to understand their pain. The Pawnee, an indigenous people with ancestral ties to the Central Plains of North America, share the story of the Ghost Bride, a profound narrative reflecting themes of tragic love, encounters with the spirit world, and the importance of honoring spiritual commitments. Next, in Ireland, we have the Bygone Echoes, or White Lady. She is your classic tragic figure, weeping for love lost or warning of impending doom. Haunting old castles and estates, she is practically the ghost patron of heartbreak and foreboding. From battlefield spirits, river maidens, these ladies in white were not our headliners today, but they are every bit as haunting and unforgettable as the ones that we mentioned. At first glance, the Lady in White stories seem like classic ghost stories. A tragic figure doomed to wander, a spooky apparition tied to a specific place. But dig deeper, and these legends reveal something much more profound. They're not just stories about ghosts, they're windows into the moral fabric and the societal anxieties of their time, offering haunting critiques of the systems that created them. Take Okiku's story in Japan. She defied a powerful man and paid with her life. Whether she's rejecting unwanted advances or exposing treachery, her tale underscores a brutal reality. In feudal Japan, honor was everything, and women were often sacrificed to maintain it. Her punishment wasn't about justice, it was about erasing her defiance, a reminder of the rigid hierarchies that kept women silent and powerless. Similarly, Llorona, whose grief-filled cries for her children have terrified generations, reflect cultural expectations placed on women. On one hand, she's a cautionary tale about a maternal figure, echoing impossible standards of motherhood. On the other hand, she symbolizes rage, a betrayal, an abandonment, and the crushing weight of expectations that she couldn't escape. Her eternal punishment feels less about her actions and more about a society's obsession with controlling women, roles, and identities. Even Charlotte White at Portchester Castle fits this pattern, her leap into the moat to save her child line pouring ideas of self-sacrificing motherhood. Yet her ghostly presence lingers as a reminder that no amount of love can shield us from life's tragedies or society's relentless demands on women. Her stories bridge the personal and the cultural, calling attention to the emotional toll of such ideas impose. These legends endure because they reflect something timeless, the fear of stepping outside of societal norms and the injustice that often follows. But here's the twist. They're also acts of defiance. These women have been silenced in life, but in death, they refuse to be ignored. Their ghosts force us to confront the systems that oppress them, challenging us to question the values and fears that we've inherited. Ultimately, these stories are as much about the cultures that created them as they are about the ghosts themselves. They're reflections of collective fears, values, and injustices, and by haunting us, these figures compel us to face the uncomfortable truths of humanity and history, making them more than just legends. They're enduring critiques of what it means to be human. The Lady in White phenomenon is, in my opinion, truly spectacular. These tales aren't just relics of the past, they continue to evolve and resonate. Even in our modern world, you'll find them around campfires and history books and in mainstream media, not just as fictional horror, but as stories that still hold meaning. Even in this day and age, we find ways to connect with them. From Llorona's chilling presence in contemporary films to Resurrection Mary's enduring place in urban legend lore, these stories remind us that our fears and our values are just as relevant today as they were decades ago, and even centuries ago. By keeping these tales alive, we don't just honor the past, we reflect on how they challenged societal norms and offered us a chance to reshape the systems that they critique. Now, I could talk about this topic all day. We didn't even touch on folklore's influence, and we didn't get to talk about the impact of fairies and the fae, but we will save those tales for another day. So what do all these ghostly women in white teach us? On the surface, they are cautionary tales and tragic figures woven into the folklore of their cultures. But underneath, they are so much more. These stories are windows into our shared fears, our deepest regrets, and the pressure society has placed on women for generations. The Lady in White isn't just a ghost. She's a reminder of what happens when grief, injustice, and societal expectations collide. She reflects the sacrifices women have been forced to make, the pain of being silenced, and the rage of having no way out. And yet, her persistence, the way she lingers in our stories, our imaginations, and even our dreams, proves that she is not going anywhere. From Charlotte diving into the moat for her child to Llorona wailing by the river, these women have come from different places and times, but they all share the same haunting power. The ability to make us think about what we value, what we fear, and what we failed to change. Those stories are about more than just bumps in the night or eerie shadows. They're about the weight of history, the echoes of injustice, and the truths that we sometimes wish we could forget. But if we listen carefully, maybe we can hear more than just the ghostly wails. Maybe we can hear a call to do better, to be better. Thanks for joining me on this haunted journey through time and across the globe. I hope these stories gave you chills, or at least maybe made you think, and possibly taught you something new about the ghosts that walk among us and the ones that we carry within. Tune in next time where we will be talking about LA Gone Wild, the 1871 Chinese massacre and America's forgotten hate crime. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Bygone Echoes. Your support helps us unearth more forgotten stories and helps keep the podcast alive, just like these legends. Follow us on social media for updates, sneak peeks, and a little extra history goodness between the episodes. And if you've got a ghost story of your own or an idea for a future episode, we'd love to hear it. Until next time, be kind, be curious, and be ready to make history.
Interested in learning more? We recommend The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell, Japanese Ghost Stories by Lafcadio Hearn La Llorona's Children, Religion, Life, and Death in the U.S.-Mexican Borderlands by Luis D. Leon, Haunted Castles of England, True Ghost Stories of England's Most Famous Castles by J.G. Montgomery, Spirits of the Place, Buddhism, and Lao Religious Culture by John Clifford Holt, The Vanishing Hitchhiker, American Urban Legends and Their Meanings by Jan Harold Brunfend. For digital resources, check out our website at www.bygoneechoes.website.